Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for attending OneSource's continuing webinar series in which we discuss key topics surrounding various aspects of IT and wireless and wireline communication. My name is Kirk Waddell. I'm the Executive Vice President of Technology here at OneSource, and I'm thrilled to introduce today my colleague and friend, Chris Miller, Director of Service Delivery. Chris has been with OneSource for 9 years and leads our wireline and wireless order teams. Prior to joining OneSource, Chris spent 8 years in the Marine Corps working in all aspects of communications, including satellite, radio, terrestrial, data, and switching. And I will say, Chris really geeks out when it comes to this technology. So we have a great resource on our call today. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks, Kirk. Glad to be here.
So, Chris, today we're going to talk about a subject that, although maybe not the sexiest in the world, but certainly one that is going to become even more critical to organizations to consider a game plan for, and that's in and around what is currently taking place associated with really the copper infrastructure, legacy PSTN, or what we like to refer to as POT service here at OneSource, which simply just refers to plain old telephone service. So, as you know, a lot of these infrastructures are aging and deteriorating rapidly. There's been certain regulatory things that have taken place, which we'll discuss, that have begun the process of phasing out some of these networks and services. And I think the purpose of this call is really, I would be willing to guess almost all attendees on this call have some type of POTS application in their environment currently. Some of these perhaps tied to very mission critical applications, although rarely used. And so I want to talk to you today about what the impacts of this are from a customer experience standpoint. What are some of the applications that are associated with these types of services? Again, these traditionally run natively on analog lines that support fire alarms, that support elevators, that support security systems. And so they're supporting these services that quite often are in the background, right? But when they're needed, it's critical that they're available. And so today I want to just provide our audience with just some critical guidance to help them reduce operational risk around this quote unquote decommissioning of the POTS telephone environment. And what are some of the options that they should be entertaining in regards to replacement products that are out there? So really looking forward to this discussion, and I think it has very high application again for a lot of our users. Just real quick before we get started, just a quick housekeeping note: we will be taking questions throughout this webinar. You should see at the end of the webinar, you should see a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And so certainly as questions arise, as Chris and I are discussing this topic, please post your questions there and we will get to as many of them at the end of our discussion as possible. So Chris, let's just kind of start foundationally and let's just kind of educate our participants here on what is POTS service exactly.
So POTS service is essentially, it's a plain old telephone line. I mean, it's a type of service that we probably remember, back in the day when we had answering machines that took tape recorders and hung on a kitchen wall. So essentially it's 2 wires, 48 volts of direct current, and it's an analog signal. I think a lot of us drive by sometimes and see these pedestals that kind of got a bird's nest in them. Really, those are, how that service is getting to the premise. I mean, this is a antiquated and, legacy type of infrastructure that has supported it. There are, the individuals who have the knowledge and expertise working these old switches are retiring. And, I think the providers have found that it's, not cost effective to continue to maintain that service. And at the same time, it's, moving things to an internet backbone and digital. It's, kind of catching up. And one of the legacy and remaining things from a communication side that, that is being sunsetted.
Yeah, when I think about POTS line, I actually just think about the phone line in our house when I was growing up, and my dad yelling at me because I was always on the phone and nobody could get through. So that's that's what I recollect. Let's talk about you talked about how carriers, from a behavior standpoint, the cost effectiveness of it. So let's explain that a little bit. I mean, I think from a customer standpoint, there may be questions as to what's the why, what's the why behind this, and maybe if you can just touch on the difference between what's required to service this type of infrastructure from a carrier standpoint, as opposed to what's required to support an IP based or internet or software based environment.
Yeah, so from a carrier perspective, to support POTS, I mean, it comes out of a central office. Central office essentially have frames in them that have cards with that look probably like they came out of a Commodore 64, an original Atari, and that service essentially has to be maintained, et cetera. Whereas to support an internet connection, I mean, a lot of times that just backhauls to a data center somewhere, and that's really where the interface to the switch telephone network occurs, normally via SIP or some other type of voice gateway.
Yeah, I mean, I think to boil it down simplistically, it's that the latter lends itself much better to remote support through a centralized report structure, where the POTS environment requires actually hands in the field, tracing back those actual physical connections and looking for those anomalies in the environment. So it's very two foundationally different support structures for the providers. So let's go a little bit further in regards to that. I mean, that kind of addresses the cost component from a provider standpoint, just obviously the additional overhead required to support those types of services from a manpower. But let's also talk about, is there anything that's happened from a regulation standpoint or a regulatory standpoint, i.e., FCC engagement, that has created either a higher sense of urgency as it relates to this, or what impact have the regulatory bodies had on this?
So the FCC issued an order that mandates that all POTS lines in the U.S. be replaced with an alternative service by this time next year. I think it's August of 2022. That is kind of, I guess, put a little bit more urgency. There is some debate on whether that'll possibly be extended, but that has put a sense of urgency, on the service providers themselves to come up with solutions. And also, at One Source, we have several different options that we use, to aid in the transfer to, either a fiber or a wireless connection.
Yeah, and interesting. What's funny is that that FCC order that put forward that sunset date. That was a regulation that was passed, I believe, in 2010. So I mean, it's not that this regulation is just coming to fruition. This has been in the plan for some time. I agree with you from a standpoint in regards to, I think that realistically that date, quite honestly, is unrealistic for most providers to have a complete conversion from off that network. However, let's talk about some of the other things that may not change, and that's really as it relates to the regulatory oversight when it comes to pricing of these services. If you can, let's talk to our attendees about what we're seeing in the marketplace in regards to pricing behavior. Also, just overall behavior when it comes to term dispositions and things like that. Why don't you talk to our audience about, again, what we're seeing from a price modeling standpoint?
When I started at OneSource 8 years ago, we could get a POTS line for under $30. And over the years, we've progressively seen even in contract rates for POTS lines go to 35, 45, 55, 65, and tariff rates are out of contract rates, can be a couple $100 now, whereas they used to be about $120. So I don't see any indication that these price increases are going to stop. I think we've seen significant price increases is also on, I don't know if anybody knows what a BRI is, but on BRI lines and also on T1s too. I mean, we can't really sell T1s anymore just because the carriers are not installing them. But even if you have any, legacy PRIs, or maybe you have POT service and you don't even know you have a T1 there, but it's actually being broken out via T1. We're seeing significant price increases for services that are delivered via those.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, that you do. This is expanding beyond just plain old telephone service, right? It is impacting again legacy T1 services, which, to your point, used to be very visible to customers because they were typically carrying internet traffic as well as voice traffic, or in a lot of situations, and now obviously through through the sophistication of other ISP networks, fiber, coax, those types of things, that's much less prominent, and so therefore the services, those POTS lines are still residing on those T1 services, perhaps unbeknownst to a lot of the consumers out there. So I think that's an important point as well. One of the things that I also want to point out is that, behaviorally from a carrier standpoint, it used to be that when a service, one of these legacy services such as POTS lines, would come out of a term contract, that really the pre-negotiated rate would be grandfathered through, right? And so until the customer re-engaged with the provider, that pricing kind of stayed the same. Now, we're seeing there's definitely been a complete reversal in regards to that methodology, in that these carriers are policing these contracts very closely from a billing standpoint. And the month that they go out of contract, again, those rates are ballooning by 200% in some situations. And so the financial exposure there for end customers, it can be significant if you're talking about a dense POTS environment. Let's move on and talk about as you're evaluating what some of your POTS replacement alternatives are. What are some of the things that you should be mindful of as you're going through this evaluation process?
Yep, absolutely. So first, I think we do want to identify what devices are we required, or either from a compliance standpoint or a regulatory standpoint that require POTS service. So as Kirk mentioned earlier, we're talking fire alarms, burglar alarms, elevator lines, pool phones. And there is also some stuff such as monitoring, whether it's some type of temperature monitoring, et cetera. So really going through and identifying those, what those specific services are. So as we look at a solution, really there's two options. One is we're going to send that traffic out via the internet now, or the second option would be wirelessly, like LTE. So when we look at a solution, I would probably encourage the audience to look at a solution that's actually a hybrid of both. So the internet would be the primary means which that phone call or that connection would go out, but then LTE would be the backup. So in case the internet went down at any point, you would still have coverage and monitoring. Another thing would be to look at potentially power redundancy. So a lot of the solutions that we have include battery backup that'll last for up to 24 hours. And that's important because if you do have some type of power interruption, your alarm, or at least the connection to it, would still work, or a pool phone or an elevator line, etc. And then I think the last one probably is, looking at the price, because these solutions do vary based on price, but on average, we see anywhere from a 30 to 50% reduction in cost compared to a POTS line that would be out of contract. So they're comparable per line to where in contract POTS rates were a couple years ago. So somewhere in the $35 to $50, depending on the features and et cetera.
Gotcha. That's very helpful. One of the things I think that is important for our audience to understand is that there are some things that you can leverage, or there are things through this conversion process that can help future-proof your organization. Let's talk about some of those things in regards to what are some of the things that our participants could take advantage of that again would put them in a position to, while they're making this investment, to do this conversion that would allow them to perhaps utilize these facilities in a different way than perhaps what they are right now.
Yeah, one of the things I think is fiber. We've seen the price of fiber come down significantly, and I think there's still a misconception that I'm going to spend $500 a month on a 20 meg fiber circuit. And yeah, for a dedicated circuit with, SLAs attached to it, you will. But most of the service providers now offer best effort fiber. And in a lot of instances, it's a symmetrical connection at really coax prices. So as we look at this, I would definitely encourage to make sure that from a internet perspective, that we do have capacity, and that we do have ideally coax and fiber, especially into like those mission critical locations.
As we're evaluating POTS replacement service, is there anything that the audience or attendees need to be aware of in regards to changes that they may have to make with equipment or infrastructure, or are most of these kind of in a box solution that requires minimal change of CPE or anything like that from a customer standpoint?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, most of these solutions are pretty much turnkey and compatible with a wide variety of alarm systems, call boxes, et cetera. There's not going to be any change to any inside wiring. This is still going to be punch over to a 66 block and still be a RJ11 connection at whatever that terminal device is. So, there's not any infrastructure enhancements that need to occur on the premise really to support this. All you need is an internet connection. Back to one of the earlier things, and another benefit is around 90% of break fixes for these solutions can be done remotely. If we think, about POTS service, a lot of times in order to fix a POTS line, it's going to require a technician to go out and repair like an F2 cable or something. So, but with these solutions, pretty much everything can be done remotely. I mean, the device can be monitored remotely, it can be troubleshooted remotely, and it can be reconfigured if necessary remotely.
Yeah, and let's also, and of course, this is geographic dependent, but I mean, there are a lot of areas in which these copper networks have become almost completely dilapidated. And so just from a minimization of trouble management, would it be safe to say that moving these services to, over the top fiber solution, or, an LTE solution, how does that impact my trouble management activity, in your opinion?
I think it decreases it significantly. I mean, I think your mean time, when you do have issues, your mean time to repair is decreased because it can be done remotely. And the fact, a lot of times we don't know that a pot's lined down until either, the alarm company reaches out and says, I haven't got a signal for 30 days, et cetera. With here, you actually have proactive monitoring. So you will know if there's a fault essentially at the time the fault occurs, not 30 days later or during a fire inspection or et cetera.
Gotcha. So I think we touched on this a little bit earlier, but maybe we can expand upon it a little bit, and maybe also during this point in the conversation, perhaps discuss those types of services that may be classified as POTS, but that aren't technically going to be impacted by this order from the FCC. So could you kind of again expand upon the type, what are the different flavors of POTS replacement service, how expansive as are they in the marketplace, and what are also maybe some misnomers out there that where someone may be thinking, oh, I have POTS service, but actually by the way that's being delivered, you're not actually applicable here.
Yeah, so if you have coax service and your voice service is delivered via your cable provider, you're not bound by this. That service isn't being replaced. Also, if I have voice service that's being delivered via anything aside from a T1, so if I've got voice service where I've got FXX channels that are broken off of a fiber circuit, or SIP trunks, et cetera, none of that here is covered. So we're talking really just the legacy plain old telephone service. So with that, the solutions that we are really seeing, I mean, at the very bottom, really you have essentially a almost like a cellular modem. And I mean, that's, we've migrated a lot of clients over to cellular modems. Verizon has a product, and essentially what it is, it's just a cellular modem that has 2 RJ11 ports and it can support 2 phone numbers. And
hey Chris, yep. Quick question there. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think this is an important point because from my standpoint, if I'm listening to this, I might think, oh wow, does that change my management behavior in regards to these services, so that now I have to treat it more as a wireless service than I did than really a wireline service. So in other words, if I'm looking at LTE service, do I have to be worried about overages in a traditional LTE instance, or things of that nature? Or from a budgetary standpoint, is this static pricing that's easily forecasted?
Yeah, that's a good point. So I mean, that's benefit of having one source, because we actually monitor that, but it depends on the product. So a lot of times the Verizon product that I'm referring to it doesn't necessarily have a data plan. You're actually just paying for the line charges. It's flat, it's predictable. Now with some of the other options though out there, an option that has internet connectivity and LTE backup, or just primary LTE, yeah, there actually can be data plans that are associated with them that do have to be managed, and a lot of times a 250 meg data plan will be sufficient, but it is something that you do need to be cognizant of, that it does have to be monitored and managed to make sure there's not significant overages. And we do see that sometimes. You have an alarm system that's a little bit wonky, and it's ET phoning home 24/7 for a month, and we get the plan, and oh yeah, used 100 gigs of data, something's going on here. So
yeah, I think that goes back to kind of what you were stating before, and that you can't really treat all of these POTS applications the same, right? You really kind of have to understand what your consumption needs are in regards to that. It's unfortunately not one size fits all in this solutioning. So there are nuances in the solutioning that if done effectively can create efficiencies from a pricing standpoint, certainly. So, Chris, before we open it up to Q&A, as we're about at the end of our time here, any kind of any last last comments that you'd like to make, or any leave behinds, before we get to Q&A in regards to, how I should be thinking about this, or, how I should be planning this. Just, what do you think are some of just the key things that our attendees need to be thinking about?
Yeah, I would encourage our audience to be proactive in moving forward with replacing their POTS lines, not waiting until they receive a letter stating that on this specific date, these services are no longer going to be supported and disconnected. So essentially at this point,
because we are seeing that, by the way.
are seeing that.
Yes.
Yeah, we do see that. So I would encourage them to be, proactive. And another thing too is really looking at the cost analysis, that we can put together. I think in a lot of cases, you'll find that this is actually going to save you a little bit of money and free that up to maybe, put that elsewhere. And I think, to your point, really going and knowing not all of these devices have the same requirements, whether that's from a regulatory standpoint or, from a consumption of, data standpoint. So knowing what those are, we can certainly help guide, with the solutions that we have. We actually have them in our lab here in Greenville, and we're testing them, with various analog devices just to make sure, it's compatible. We don't want to, put something out there that's not compatible and is not given, the desired result.
Yeah, and I think even to back it up just a step further, it is a challenge for a lot of organizations, is how much visibility do you have into your POTS environment, or do you actually know at the asset level what those services are? Can you identify those numbers in your environment? And so if you've actually not gone through the process of basically doing an inventory assessment to know actually where those services reside, you risk the high potential of either interrupting services that you didn't intend to interrupt through this conversion, and or miss services through this conversion. So having a clean, asset inventory list of those associated services by physical address and by use is the foundational component that is required before you can even get into the solutioning aspect. So, for any of our attendees that lack that visibility, that's going to be the foundational baseline that you're going to have to start with in order to successfully, migrate these services. So, Chris, let's see if we've got any questions here. And we do. Here's one. We'll start with this one. In a large emergency, the cellular network will be swamped. So if people are trapped in an elevator, this does not seem to be a good solution. Are there prioritized options for alarms, elevators? Are you saying that internet devices would be the recommended solution here?
I think internet would be a recommended solution. I mean, that's valid. I mean, in an emergency, cellular networks could be overwhelmed. There are, I know, for at least the solutions that we have, these are essentially on a prioritized network with AT&T and Verizon. Essentially, it's almost like the network that they carve out for first responders and other emergencies.
ReadyNet, that type of thing. Which
so that would actually get preference. But at the same time, for an elevator line, I do think, as long as you can get an internet connection or have a drop to that elevator, but a lot of times maybe that's not possible, just because of how far that could be away from a centralized data closet. So I probably would recommend, a combination internet as primary with cellular as backup. Yeah.
Gotcha. Thank you. Here's another one. We're seeing issues in availability for POTS replacement devices. I know where this one's going. Alternative communicators for alarm systems, presumably due to supply chains issues, is one source experiencing these shortages in inventory. Chris, do you want to take first crack at that, and then I'll provide a little bit more global oversight there? But
Yeah, so yes, specifically, I think it's because of the chip shortage.
yeah.
One of our vendors stated that they had 200 on hand, where ideally, normally at any given time, they should have a couple thousand on hand. So we are seeing some availability issues.
Yeah, and I think that will recover as time goes on. This is kind of across the board for us, just for our audience in regards to really anything with a silicon chip in it. But again, we're seeing this across the board, whether it be infrastructure, whether it be media converters, whether it be in essence what are these LTE IADs or integrated access devices that are converting these services out to the analog signal. So, Britt, to answer your question specifically, yes, we are all in this together. I can tell you that it is something that we monitor with all of our distributors and manufacturers to determine what that lead time is. But I think that points that really you should begin this planning process sooner rather than later to leave yourself with plenty of time. Here's one from Anonymous. So we have several POTS lines that are configured at the carrier. Oh, wow, traditional ring down services. So to directly call the local 911 center when the phone is off hook, what would be the solution to duplicate that setup? That's a great question. Chris, I'll give you first crack at that if you have an idea, but that is actually an excellent question.
That is a very good question. So I don't know if with an appliance, I don't know if that can be configured to essentially emulate what is being done by the phone company and direct dialing 911. A lot of times, so like I'll use Kings 3, for example. Kings 3 has boxes that they put on site. And those boxes, so for like a pool phone, for example, when you pick up the pool phone's going to automatically dial 911, but the logic to do so is actually in the Kings 3 box, not residing with the phone company in the central office.
Yeah, I think there are some customized solutions through IP-based telephony that can, to a certain extent, emulate what you're talking about in regards to if a phone goes off hook and after a period of time would then dial out to 911. There are programming parameters that would allow that. To say that it's going to work exactly like the current environment is today, I think that would be a misnomer. I would be interested for this particular person to understand a little bit more about the application as well as the, how are these being utilized and what environment are these being utilized to solution that more. But really excellent question. Our last question here is: do you believe this will expedite the federal rural broadband initiative with respect to small ILECs?
Not necessarily. I think they appropriated, or if my memory serves, around 10 billion or so at the federal level for it. It's going to take a lot more than $10 billion to deliver hardline internet connections to all the rural municipalities and even across this country. I think where we're going is more on towards the cellular and potentially even satellite side. It's more cost effective for rural locations to get their service from the sky than spending the money and putting it in the ground.
Yeah, I think I can't remember who asked that question. Brady, to provide a little more context there. I think that's why I prefaced when we were talking about the actual sunset date of when these services will be sunsetted. I think you nailed it in regards to what is going to dictate whether that date gets pushed back. and that is the evolution of the broadband network, and how quickly this infrastructure gets built out. And I think Chris is being realistic in his opinion there, and I agree in that. I don't know necessarily that it's going to expedite the solution. I think it's probably just going to create a situation in which that deadline is pushed out. We could discuss, we could have a complete separate discussion on whether or not that then moves into the area of perhaps predatory practices from a billing standpoint, from the service providers. But great question. And again, I think that's ultimately what is going to impact that actual sunset date of when that network officially does go offline, and will no longer be supported in any way, shape, or form. We have one more question here. Does this, great question, does this impact residential POTS also?
Yes.
Yeah, the simplistic answer there, Chuck, is yes, it does. Hence, I don't know if there was an article that came out recently of posted by regarding Lumen in regards to the number of landline assets that they've shed over the last year or so, and that's directly correlated partially with this initiative, and people converting, either completely eliminating the home phone or converting to coax delivery. All right, I think that's all of our questions. Hopefully, one more got in just under the bell. Where did you get the sunset date? They have the document of the FCC-10-72A1 downloaded, and there is no date. That may be the original posting, Wally. Chris, I know I've seen that date, but in multiple publications.
Yeah. It's the forbearance order for analog POTS. And to your point, I've seen that date in multiple
So I'll tell you what, Wally, we will follow up with actual documentation there in terms of where we pulled that date from. Again, I would be worried less about the sunset date, and would be worried more about the financial implications, as well. Again, this arbitrary notification from the underlying service providers of their intent to no longer support these services. Again, I would almost treat this almost a little bit like the Wild Wild West. There's very, very, very limited regulatory oversight in regards to these services, and which allows carriers to really very much behave at will. All right, that is the last question we have. You're quite welcome, Wally. Thank you for your question. Everyone, thank you for joining us today. Chris, thank you. Most importantly, I think you've provided some very valuable insight for our participants today. If you have any questions about this topic that we did not address, or ideas for future topics, by all means, please reply to the email that you will receive. That will also include a link to the presentation today that you can go back and review at your leisure. And we would like to let all attendees know that we would be more than happy to provide a service line review in order to evaluate your current inventory and make some recommendations as it relates to solutioning on how both the plan to combat this, as well as the financial modeling around it, as well as the project planning component. So if you have interest in that, by all means, please reach out. For any of our existing customers that joined the call today, know that this is an initiative that will be front and center with our customer success team in future engagements. And so they will be communicating this to you and providing those solutions to you proactively. So be on the lookout for those, and certainly in your discussion interactions or your QBRs with your customer success team. Other than that, I think that concludes our time for today. Again, I want to thank everyone for their participation. Hope everyone has a great remainder of the week. Please stay safe, stay healthy, and thanks again. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.